My husband forgot his smartwatch records phone calls, and it captured the one conversation he never meant me to hear. Mark bought that smartwatch 8 months ago, mostly to track his runs, a birthday gift to himself after finally committing to a training plan for a half marathon he'd been talking about for years. I never paid it much attention beyond the occasional comment about his step count or his resting heart rate, the kind of casual, low-stakes engagement most spouses have with a partner's fitness tracker. I certainly never knew it could record phone calls until the night I found out entirely by accident, syncing it to our shared family tablet to troubleshoot a notification issue that had been bothering him for weeks. Mark and I had been married 11 years by that point, together for 14 if you counted the 2 years we dated before the wedding, long enough to have built the kind of comfortable, familiar rhythm that I'd always assumed was simply what a good marriage looked like after the initial intensity faded into something steadier. We had 2 kids, ages 8 and 11, a house we'd worked hard to renovate room by room over the years, a life that felt from the inside entirely stable, if occasionally strained by the ordinary pressures of work and parenting, and the general exhaustion of managing a full household. If you'd asked me, the week before I found that recording, how my marriage was doing, I would have said fine, genuinely without hesitation, the kind of unremarkable fine that most long marriages settle into once the initial romance gives way to logistics and routine. Looking back now, I can identify small signs I'd noticed without fully registering their significance at the time: Mark taking more calls in his car instead of inside the house, a slight increase in evening work events that kept him out later than usual, a subtle new habit of angling his phone screen away from me when texts came in. None of it had struck me as alarming in isolation. Marriages have natural ebbs and flows, and I'd chalked up his growing distance to a demanding stretch at work, a promotion he'd been chasing for over a year that had genuinely increased his workload. I had no reason at the time to suspect any of it was actually something else entirely. The app synced everything automatically once connected: workouts, sleep data, and apparently a folder of audio recordings I hadn't known existed, generated whenever Mark used the watch's call recording feature during phone conversations, something he must have enabled at some point without either of us discussing it, likely for work calls he wanted to reference later. Most of the file names were exactly what I expected, labeled with contact names I recognized: colleagues, his brother, an old college friend he talked to occasionally about fantasy football. One file, dated 3 weeks earlier, was labeled simply unknown number, timestamped for a Tuesday afternoon when Mark had told me he was in back-to-back meetings. I want to be honest that I almost didn't open it. Some instinct, some flicker of self-protection, told me that whatever was on that recording might not be something I wanted to hear, that the appropriate, trusting response was to simply close the folder and never mention it, the way a good partner extends privacy even when opportunity presents itself. I sat with that instinct for a long moment, my finger hovering over the file, before curiosity, or maybe some deeper, more accurate intuition than I wanted to admit to myself, won out. The recording was 11 minutes long. I recognized Mark's voice immediately, relaxed in a way I hadn't heard from him in months, warmer, easier, the version of him I remembered from early in our marriage before work stress and the slow accumulation of daily life had settled into something more distant between us. The other voice belonged to a woman. I didn't recognize it at first, though something in the familiarity of their conversation, the easy rhythm of 2 people who clearly knew each other well, made my stomach tighten before I'd even processed a single specific word. They talked about ordinary things at first: her upcoming work trip, a restaurant they'd apparently both wanted to try, a shared joke about a mutual acquaintance that made them both laugh in a way that felt uncomfortably intimate to overhear. It was around minute 4 that the conversation shifted into something I couldn't misunderstand or rationalize away, no matter how badly some part of me wanted to. "I miss this," the woman said. "I miss you. I know we said we'd wait until things settled down, but some days I don't know how much longer I can do the waiting part." "I know," Mark said, his voice softer than I'd heard it in longer than I could remember. "I think about it constantly. I just need to figure out the right way to handle things at home. I don't want to blow everything up messily. I want to do this right for everyone's sake, especially the kids." I sat frozen at our kitchen table, the tablet in my hands, listening to my husband discuss, in the calm, practical tone he usually reserved for discussing mortgage refinancing or car maintenance, some version of a plan to leave our marriage, a plan that apparently already involved another woman, one he clearly cared about deeply enough to be actively navigating an exit strategy around, while I remained completely unaware that anything in our marriage was even seriously strained. At alone approaching a breaking point, I remember the specific physical sensation of listening to that section of the recording, a kind of cold, spreading numbness starting in my chest and moving outward through my arms, my hands actually trembling slightly as I gripped the tablet, replaying that exact exchange 3 times in a row before I could bring myself to continue listening to the rest. There's something uniquely disorienting about hearing your spouse's voice, a voice you know as intimately as your own, discussing the calculated unraveling of your shared life in a tone so calm it could have been mistaken for a conversation about weekend plans. I kept waiting for some indication that I'd misheard, some context that would soften what was so plainly, unmistakably clear, and it never came. The rest of the recording continued in that same devastating vein: logistics about timing, vague references to when things are more settled at work. A discussion about whether to wait until after our older daughter's school year ended before making any major changes. All of it discussed with a level of careful, deliberate planning that made clear this wasn't a fleeting emotional affair or a moment of weakness. This was something sustained, something with a shape and a timeline, something Mark had apparently been building toward for long enough to have real logistics worked out with another woman before I'd had any indication anything was wrong at all. Near the end of the recording, the woman's tone shifted into something more vulnerable, almost pleading. "I just need to know this is real," she said. "I need to know I'm not going to be the one left holding all the risk here while you figure out your timeline." Mark's response, reassuring her in a voice full of a tenderness I hadn't heard directed at me in longer than I wanted to admit, was somehow the detail that hurt the most out of the entire 11 minutes. Not the plan itself, not even the specifics of the timeline, but the plain, audible evidence that he still had that particular kind of warmth in him, and had simply stopped offering it to me long before I had any idea it was gone. I didn't confront him that night. I want to be honest about that, because I think it matters to understanding how deeply this discovery destabilized me. I sat with that recording, replaying certain sections 3, 4, 5 times, trying to absorb details I'd missed on the first listen, trying to identify the woman's voice, trying to reconcile the version of my marriage I thought I'd been living inside with the one I'd just accidentally uncovered evidence of. Mark came home that evening at his usual time, kissed me hello the way he always did, asked about my day, and I answered him somehow, functioning through a conversation that felt entirely surreal given what I now knew and he had no idea I knew. It took me 4 days to figure out how I wanted to handle it. I spent those days in a strange, controlled kind of shock, going through the motions of ordinary life, making dinner, helping our daughter with homework, all while quietly gathering myself for a conversation I knew was coming, but wasn't ready to have yet. I listened to the recording several more times during those 4 days, each time noticing new details I'd missed before, including, on the 4th listen, a moment where Mark mentioned the woman's name directly, calling her Steph, a detail that let me finally piece together who she likely was, once I cross-referenced it against his phone contacts and eventually his work email signature chain, which included a Stephanie Reyes from an account services team he'd been collaborating with on a project for the past several months. Those 4 days tested a version of self-control I didn't know I had. I remember one evening in particular, the 3rd night, sitting across from Mark at dinner while our kids argued about whose turn it was to pick the next movie, watching him laugh at something our son said, completely unaware that I now knew in devastating detail exactly what he'd been discussing 3 weeks earlier with another woman. I excused myself early that night, telling him I had a headache, and sat alone in our bathroom for nearly 20 minutes, running the faucet so no one would hear me cry, trying to figure out how I was going to hold myself together long enough to plan my next move properly, instead of exploding in a way that might cost me leverage I didn't yet understand I even had. I also spent those 4 days consulting a lawyer, quietly on my own, wanting to understand my actual options and rights before I said anything to Mark at all. I learned, among other things, that our state was a one-party consent state for recorded conversations, meaning the recording itself, having been made by Mark's own device during a call he was a direct participant in, was legally admissible if things ever moved toward a formal separation, a detail that gave me a strange, cold kind of clarity as I moved through those 4 days of careful, deliberate preparation. My lawyer, a calm, methodical woman named Denise who specialized in family law, walked me through exactly what steps to take to preserve the recording properly, advising me to back it up in multiple secure locations before confronting Mark, in case he attempted to delete the original file from his device once he realized I'd found it. That practical advice, oddly, gave me something concrete to focus my energy on during those 4 disorienting days, a task I could actually control while everything else about my life felt like it was quietly dissolving underneath me. When I finally confronted Mark, I did it on a Saturday morning, after our daughter had left for a sleepover at a friend's house, giving us privacy for whatever conversation was about to unfold. I didn't ease into it. I played the recording for him directly, watching his face drain of color as he heard his own voice from 3 weeks earlier, discussing an exit plan from our marriage with a woman I now knew to be a work colleague he'd apparently been involved with for months. "How long have you been recording your calls?" he asked first, which struck me, even in that raw moment, as a strange initial response, focusing on the mechanism of discovery rather than the substance of what had actually been discovered. "That's what you want to lead with," I said, "not an explanation, not an apology. You want to know how I found out rather than addressing what I actually found." He didn't have a good response to that, sitting in a silence that stretched long enough to become its own kind of answer. When he finally did speak, It wasn't the explanation I might have hoped for, some acknowledgement of genuine wrongdoing, some real reckoning with what he'd built behind my back. Instead, it was a halting, incomplete attempt to minimize what I'd heard, to frame the relationship as something that hadn't gone as far as it sounded. A claim I found difficult to reconcile with an 11-minute recording that included specific discussions of timing our children's school schedule around the eventual end of our marriage. "You were planning an entire exit strategy," I said, "around our kids' schedules, without me having any idea anything was wrong." How exactly does that not go as far as it sounded? He didn't have an answer for that either. He tried, a few minutes later, a different tactic, asking whether we could work through this, whether the affair, as he now reluctantly called it, had to mean the end of our marriage entirely. I told him, as calmly as I could manage given the circumstances, that the affair itself, painful as it was, wasn't even the part I found most unforgivable. What I couldn't get past was the calculated, deliberate planning underneath it, the fact that he'd been quietly constructing an exit from our life together, weighing our children's school calendar as a logistical variable, all while continuing to come home every evening and perform the role of a devoted husband who had no idea our marriage was already, secretly, on its way out. Weeks following that confrontation were some of the most difficult of my adult life, moving through the practical mechanics of a marriage's collapse while still trying to maintain some sense of stability for our 2 children, who had no idea their entire family structure was quietly dissolving around a recording their father hadn't known existed until his own wife played it back to him at the kitchen table. Mark moved out 3 weeks later, into a temporary apartment that I later learned Stephanie had actually helped him find, a detail that confirmed, if I'd needed further confirmation, exactly how developed and sustained their relationship had already become by the time I discovered it. He tried, in those 3 weeks before he moved out, to salvage something between us, suggesting couples counseling, apologizing in increasingly desperate ways as the reality of what he stood to lose finally seemed to set in. I told him I appreciated that he was finally taking it seriously, but that the time for taking it seriously had been 3 weeks earlier, in that 11-minute phone call, not now, after I'd already found the recording and had months to sit with exactly what it revealed about the kind of choices he was capable of making without my knowledge. I found a therapist for myself fairly quickly, understanding that processing a betrayal this calculated, this quietly premeditated, was going to require more support than I could manage entirely on my own. I also eventually told my 2 closest friends the full story, both of whom had the same reaction I'd had initially, a kind of stunned disbelief at the specific detail of the recording, at the strange, almost cinematic accident of discovery that had revealed something Mark had clearly worked hard to keep hidden. The divorce process, once it began formally, moved forward with a clarity I hadn't expected to feel, in part because that recording removed any ambiguity about what had actually happened, any possibility of Mark rewriting the narrative into something softer or more sympathetic than the truth actually was. My lawyer used it carefully as leverage in negotiations around asset division and custody arrangements, not out of vindictiveness, but because it established, clearly and irrefutably, a timeline that mattered legally in ways I hadn't fully understood until I was living inside the process myself. I told our children the truth in stages, carefully, with guidance from a family therapist who specialized in helping kids process divorce, giving them only what was age-appropriate while still being honest that this wasn't a mutual, amicable decision the way some divorcing parents like to frame things for the sake of their kids. My daughter, older and more perceptive, eventually asked me directly, months later, whether Dad had cheated. I told her the truth simply, without embellishing or dramatizing it further than the facts already warranted, because I'd decided early on that protecting her from an age-appropriate version of reality wasn't the same thing as protecting her from unnecessary pain. I think about that recording sometimes. The strange, arbitrary accident of a smartwatch feature Mark had probably forgotten was even active, capturing exactly the conversation he most needed to keep hidden from me. I don't know if I ever would have found out the truth without it, or how much longer I might have continued living inside a marriage that had already, secretly, been planned around its own ending. Some nights I lie awake wondering what would have happened if that notification issue had never come up, if I'd never had a reason to sync that watch to our tablet at all, whether I'd still be sitting across from Mark at dinner right now, mistaking his calm, familiar presence for an intact marriage rather than one already quietly scheduled for its own dissolution. What I know for certain is that I stopped assuming a calm, settled home life necessarily meant a calm, settled marriage underneath it. Sometimes the person sitting across from you at dinner, asking about your day in the same familiar tone they've used for years, is already quietly planning an entirely different future, one that doesn't include you, timed carefully around your own children's school calendar, while you remain completely unaware that anything has changed at all.